The blood
Move,
hit the
get him
floor
inside
before
now.
anyone
This way,
screamed.
trauma bay is
A
ready.
man was dying
Almost
on
there,
a
hold
gurney in
on.
the middle
Clear
of
the
North
path,
Haven
get the
Medical
crash
Center's
cart.
trauma
He's
bay.
losing blood, hurry!
Chest
Inside,
caving with every
now.
labored breath, and 12 trained medical professionals stood frozen, hands up, eyes wide, while armed soldiers in full combat gear filled the doorway with rifles drawn. Then a soldier spoke. Not to the doctors, not to the charge nurse barking orders from behind the desk. To nobody. To the woman everyone had spent 6 months treating like she wasn't even there. "Where's Viper?" The room stopped breathing. And Evelyn Drake, supply nurse, invisible, the woman they made fetch bedpans and restocked gauze, set down her clipboard and walked straight into the center of that chaos like she'd been waiting for it. If this story already has you gripping your seat, stay with me until the end. Like this video, drop a comment with the city you're watching from, and let's see how far this story travels. The morning Evelyn Drake arrived at North Haven Medical Center, she carried 2 things: a duffel bag with 3 changes of scrubs and a personnel file so redacted it looked like someone had spilled ink across it. HR didn't ask questions. Most people didn't. She had her nursing credentials, her Colorado license, her references, all legitimate, all carefully chosen for what they didn't reveal. The hiring coordinator, a young guy named Paul who smelled like instant coffee and wore a tie that was slightly too short, flipped through her paperwork twice and then offered her a handshake. "Welcome to North Haven," he said. "You'll be on floor rotation first, then they'll probably move you to ER support once Linda signs off." Linda Mercer, charge nurse. She runs the ER. He paused, rearranging something on his desk. "Just keep your head down the first few weeks. She has a system." Evelyn had learned to translate that kind of pause. It meant she has a temper, and new people are targets until they're not. "Understood," she said. She found out what Linda's system looked like on her 4th day. The ER at North Haven ran like most mid-sized hospital emergency departments, controlled chaos dressed up as procedure, with the charge nurse as the fulcrum around which everything either balanced or collapsed.
Linda Mercer had been that fulcrum for 11 years. She was 52, compact, with silver hair she kept in a severe bun, and reading glasses she wore on a beaded chain around her neck like a weapon. She was competent. Evelyn recognized that immediately. But competence, she'd learned, didn't always produce kindness. Sometimes it produced entitlement. "Drake," Linda appeared at Evelyn's elbow during a supply count, not looking up from her tablet. "Trauma supply room is behind on inventory. Someone pulled 3 packs of chest seals last week without logging it. Go count, document, and flag anything below minimum threshold." It wasn't a question. It wasn't even really a sentence. It was a dismissal wearing a directive's clothes. "Of course," Evelyn said. Linda was already walking away. The chest seals bothered Evelyn more than the tone. 3 packs pulled without documentation? That was roughly 15 units. Either someone had gotten sloppy with the log, or there had been a significant trauma event that had eaten through supplies faster than anyone anticipated. She pulled the incident records for the past 2 weeks while she counted. There had been a bad car wreck 9 days ago, multiple casualties. That explained it. She documented everything, flagged 6 items at critical low, and left a detailed note in the supply system with timestamps. Linda never acknowledged it.
That was week 1. By week 3, Evelyn had established something like a rhythm. She came in early, worked her rotation, stayed quiet, and went home to a 1-bedroom apartment in Briar Falls that she'd furnished from a combination of a Goodwill run and whatever had come with the place. She owned a coffee maker, a second-hand couch, and a bookshelf she hadn't filled yet. She cooked simple things. She ran in the mornings on a route that took her past the edge of town, where the Colorado mountains bled into the horizon, and she let the silence of it settle over her like something physical. She didn't think about the noise. She was good at that by now. The problem with North Haven, with any place really, was that staying invisible required a kind of constant performance that eventually got exhausting. You had to know exactly how quiet to be, how small to make yourself, how to absorb condescension without flinching in a way that invited more of it. It was a calibration she'd gotten skilled at over the past 2 years. Before that, she hadn't needed it. Before that, she'd been someone else entirely. The shift that introduced her to Dr. Caleb Moore was a Tuesday, one of those sluggish late-afternoon ER slots, where the morning rush had cleared, but the evening one hadn't started yet, and the staff was caught in that strange in-between state, where half of them were trying to look busy, and the other half weren't bothering. Moore came through the double doors at 3:47 p.m., like he expected them to open on their own, which, based on how the nurses moved out of his path, they effectively did. He was 34, technically still a resident, but the kind who'd been on the department long enough that the power dynamics had blurred. Tall, the kind of face that had probably gotten him things throughout his life. He wore his confidence like it was part of his badge, and spoke to nurses the way some people spoke to search engines. Input data, receive output, do not engage further. Evelyn had seen his type in every institution she'd ever worked in. Hospitals, the military, didn't matter. Some people rose through systems by learning to be excellent. Others rose by learning to take up space. Moore was the second kind, pretending to be the first.
She stayed out of his way until she couldn't. It was 3 weeks into her rotation when she saw the code start to go wrong. The patient was a 58-year-old man named Gerald Sykes, insurance salesman from North Briar Falls. No significant cardiac history, which was part of why nobody had caught it fast enough. He'd come in complaining of chest tightness that he'd been dismissing as heartburn for 2 days. By the time someone had taken it seriously, his rhythm was deteriorating. Moore was running the code, not badly at first. He was fast, confident, calling orders in that clipped, authoritative way that read as competent until you watched the hands and not the mouth. His compressions were slightly off, too rapid, not deep enough to generate effective perfusion, the kind of air that showed up in the first 20 seconds if you knew what to look for. The patient's color was wrong. His SAT numbers were dropping. Evelyn was in the hallway, 3 feet outside the trauma bay, holding a rack of supply transport she'd been bringing down from inventory. She watched through the window in the door. 30 seconds, 45. She could see the monitor from where she stood. She pushed through the door. His compressions, she started. Moore didn't turn around. We're covered here. Get out. His SAT is dropping. The compressions aren't. I said we're covered. He did turn then, and the look on his face was not confusion. It was not interest. It was a door slamming. Who are you? Evelyn Drake, ER support. Get her out, Moore said to the room. One of the nurses, a younger one, newer than Evelyn, who looked pained about the whole thing, touched Evelyn's elbow. Come on, let's check his depth, Evelyn said louder, past her. He's not getting adequate perfusion. Check the waveform.
The monitor beeped. The waveform was shallow. Someone in the room looked at it and then looked at Moore, who was already adjusting. Whether because he'd caught it himself or because the evidence was now undeniable, it was impossible to say. His technique corrected. The numbers began to stabilize. Evelyn let herself be guided out of the doorway. In the hallway, the younger nurse exhaled, like she'd been holding her breath. You shouldn't have done that, she said quietly. I know, Evelyn said. He's going to be... I know. Moore never mentioned the code to her directly. That would have required acknowledging she'd been right. Instead, what happened over the following 2 weeks was the particular kind of institutional punishment that didn't leave marks. The small exclusions, the assignments redirected, the sense that the air in a room changed when she entered it. He mentioned her by name to Linda once, loud enough to be overheard. She couldn't catch the whole sentence, but she got, supply nurse doesn't know her role, liability. Linda had her own opinions about Evelyn's role, and they hadn't changed. You're on supply rotation this week, she told her one morning, not looking up. Stock the trauma base, check the crash carts, and stay out of active cases. I'm credentialed for. I know what your credentials say. Linda sat down her tablet. I also know that you've been here 6 weeks, and you haven't worked a trauma yet in any capacity. There's a reason we have a probationary structure, Drake. Work your rotation. Let the people who know this department handle the cases. I've worked trauma before.
It was the most dismissive sound Evelyn had ever heard. That's great. Stalk the trauma bays. She stalked the trauma bays. What she didn't do was argue. Not because she didn't have the words. She had plenty of them in several languages, a few of which she'd learned specifically because they were more efficient for shouting over the sound of helicopters, but because she'd made a deal with herself when she'd taken this job. She was here to be quiet. She was here to be invisible. She was here to exist in the smallest possible footprint, while the part of her brain that had once run on adrenaline and tactical decision-making slowly, hopefully, learned to breathe differently. The apartment helped. The morning runs helped. The fact that Briar Falls was objectively a beautiful and somewhat sleepy Colorado town, where the worst sounds were the occasional elk on the ridge and the Henderson's dog 2 floors down barking at the mail helped. She had a therapist, Dr. Wren Calloway, who she saw every other Thursday in an office that smelled like cedar and had one of those white noise machines outside the door. Wren was careful and precise, and never pushed faster than Evelyn was willing to move, which was very slowly. They talked around the edges of things, mostly the deployment stuff, the sounds, the way her nervous system had stopped being able to distinguish between threat and non-threat, took for granted. "What do you do when the noise gets loud?" Wren asked once. "Breathe," Evelyn said. "And if that doesn't work?" Evelyn had considered it. "Count the exits." Wren had written something down.
Evelyn didn't ask what. The problem with the deal she'd made with herself, the quiet, the small footprint, the careful, invisible life, was that deals were only as good as the other parties involved, and the other parties at North Haven had not agreed to any terms. It wasn't one thing. It was never one thing. It was the way Linda referred to her as the supply girl in conversations Evelyn was standing near enough to hear. It was the way Moore had apparently described her to two other residents as the nervous one from ER support. She'd gathered this from the way those two residents had looked at her in the break room one afternoon, the kind of look that contained information. It was the scheduled supply rotation week after week, while newer nurses with less experience were getting trauma floor time. It was the way one of the senior nurses, a man named Travers, who'd been at North Haven for 20 years and wore that tenure like armor, had looked at her credentials once and said, "Colorado license came through fast for someone with your gap in employment." She hadn't answered.
She'd smiled slightly and gone back to work. There were moments in the early weeks when she almost told someone. Not the whole truth, that wasn't hers to dispense casually, but enough. Enough to explain the gap in her civilian employment, enough to give the credentials context. But she'd learned the hard way, and more than once, that that kind of revelation didn't make things simpler. It made things complicated in a different way. It invited questions she didn't have the energy to answer. It changed how people looked at her, and not always in directions that helped. So she kept it folded up, the same way she kept the other things folded up, and she worked her supply rotation, and she breathed, and she counted exits. The Tuesday the helicopters came, she was restocking the trauma bay supply cart. It was 8:14 a.m. Morning rush had started but hadn't peaked yet. The ER was at about 70% capacity, which for North Haven was what quiet looked like. Evelyn had a clipboard and a cart and was working methodically through the inventory. Gloves, IV lines, chest seals, wound packing, noting levels, cross-referencing the log, doing the job she'd been assigned to do. She heard it before anyone else. She would have been the last person in that building to explain why exactly her brain cataloged sounds the way it did. Some part of it was training. Some part of it was those years of having to know before she could see what was coming, of reading the air pressure change before the rotors were even audible on a conscious level. Whatever the mechanism, by the time the first vibration trembled through the ceiling tiles above the trauma bay, she'd already set down her clipboard. Heavy rotors, military grade, multiple aircraft, close. She moved to the window. Two Blackhawks descending at an angle that was wrong for any civilian approach. Fast, low, deliberate. Not a medevac pattern, a tactical pattern.
Behind her, an alarm started. Not a medical alarm, the emergency access alarm on the ambulance bay doors, the one that only triggered when something forced them from the outside. Then the radio at the nurse's station erupted with something she couldn't fully catch from across the room, and the ER charged desk phone started ringing, and someone, Travers, she thought from the pitch of it, said, "What the hell is the—" The ambulance bay doors crashed open. They came in fast and controlled. 8 soldiers in full tactical gear, body armor, earpieces, rifles held at the low ready, not pointing at anyone, not threatening, but occupying the space, the way people occupy space when they'd been trained to take control of rooms. And the effect was immediate and total. The ER staff froze. Behind the soldiers, a gurney, 4 more people in tactical gear running it, one of them performing compressions as they moved. Real compressions, full weight, the kind that broke ribs if you did them right. The man on the gurney was big, mid-30s, wearing what remained of tactical clothing that had been cut away to access a chest wound that was even, from across the room, even through the chaos, catastrophic. Left side, the dressing they'd applied was soaked through. The improvised tension pneumothorax seal was losing.
Linda appeared from her office. Whatever she'd been about to say, whoever she'd been about to order into position stopped when she looked at the gurney. "Get Trauma 1 cleared now," she said, and her voice was doing the thing Evelyn recognized as competent panic. "Someone get Moore on the radio. We need a specific individual." The voice came from the soldier at the front of the group, the one whose bearing and positioning identified him as the person the others were oriented around. He was taller than the rest, early 40s, with a jaw like something that had been shaped by bad weather. He scanned the room with a kind of efficiency that saw everything and processed it faster than most people formed sentences. "We have a priority trauma and we need someone specific." "We have trauma staff," Linda started. "We need Viper." The room went still. It was the kind of still that happens in places that are ordinarily loud, where the background noise of a working ER, the monitors and the PA system and the rolling carts and the overlapping voices drops away all at once, and what's left is just the sound of a man dying on a gurney and 12 people who didn't understand what was happening. Linda looked around the room with the expression of someone who'd heard a word in a foreign language and was waiting for a translation. Where is Viper?" The commander said it again, not louder, more precisely. "We were told Viper was at this hospital. We need them now. That man has tension pneumo and he has minutes." Evelyn walked out from behind the supply cart. She didn't announce herself. She didn't say anything. She just moved from the edge of the room to the center of it, past Linda, past the nurses who'd pressed against the walls, past Moore, who'd appeared in the doorway from the corridor and was staring at the soldiers with an expression she couldn't read, and she walked straight up to the gurney and looked at the wound. Left-sided penetrating chest trauma, tension pneumo developing, the existing seal compromised, tracheal deviation beginning, JVD visible. He was decompensating. "How long ago?" she said. The commander turned to her. Something shifted in his face. Recognition, relief, something else under both of those that she didn't have time to examine. 40 minutes. Field seal held until about 15 minutes out.
"What do you have for me?" He gestured to one of the soldiers who was already unslinging a med pack. "I need Trauma 1, Evelyn said. Not to the commander, but to the room. To Linda specifically. Now." Linda opened her mouth. "He has 3 minutes before that tension kills him," Evelyn said. "Trauma 1 now." She moved with the gurney before anyone answered. The soldiers moved with her, and after a half-second of absolute paralysis, some of the nursing staff moved too, instinctively, following the direction of something that looked and sounded like authority. "She doesn't have clearance for Moore's," voice from behind them. "Get out of the way," the commander said. Not to Evelyn, to Moore. Evelyn heard Moore's footsteps stop. In Trauma 1, she had 20 seconds to take stock of what she was working with. 2 nurses, the younger one whose name was Priya, and an older male nurse named Garrett, who had the face of someone who'd seen enough to stay functional in a crisis. Plus whatever the soldiers had in their med pack and whatever North Haven's trauma bay had on hand. "Needle decompression first," she said. 14 gauge, second intercostal midclavicular. "Give me." Priya already had the tray. She placed the needle. The rush of air was audible. The man's oxygen saturation, plummeting on the monitor when they'd rolled in, stopped falling. "He's going to need a chest tube," she said. "Get me a..." "Already pulled," Garrett said, and he had it. She worked. Not fast in the way that looks impressive from the outside, not the dramatic speed of television medicine, but fast in the way that actually counted, which was deliberate and sequenced, and without the half-second hesitations that came from uncertainty. She knew what the next step was before she'd finished the current one. She knew what the patient's body was going to do before it did it, because she'd seen this before. She'd seen this in places where the closest trauma center was an hour away by helicopter and the helicopter was busy, and the decision was yours to make with what was in your hands. Blood soaked through her second pair of gloves before the tube was seated. "Breathe sounds," she said. Priya put the stethoscope to his chest. Bilateral. The monitor changed. Saturation climbing. Heart rate still high. Still wrong in several ways, but stabilizing in the direction of survivable. The commander was standing at the edge of the trauma bay.
He hadn't entered, hadn't interfered, hadn't done anything except watch with the focused stillness of someone who learned that the best thing you could do in a crisis was stay out of the way of the person handling it. When the monitor numbers started climbing, something shifted in his posture that had nothing to do with military bearing and everything to do with being human. "He's going to need surgery," Evelyn said. "Get me your best thoracic surgeon." "That would be Dr. Ayasha Okafor," Priya said. "She's already been paged." Evelyn looked at the man on the table. He was still unconscious, still critical, still a long way from safe, but he was alive in a way that had been genuinely uncertain 4 minutes ago. Outside the trauma bay, she could hear Linda's voice elevated and the sound of administrative chaos beginning to organize itself, the way institutions responded to disruption by immediately trying to determine whose fault it was and how to document it. She didn't go out there yet. She kept her hands where they were and her eyes on the monitor, and she breathed slowly, the way Wren had taught her, the way she'd been practicing for 2 years in an apartment above a dog that barked at mail. And she let the noise outside the room be someone else's problem for another few minutes. The commander spoke from the doorway. "Viper," he said quietly. She didn't look up. "That's not my name anymore." "No," he agreed. "Right now, it might be the only one that matters." She heard footsteps in the hall, quick ones, authoritative ones, the distinct rhythm of Dr. Okafor moving fast towards something important. Evelyn had heard that rhythm before and registered it as someone she'd want in the room. She stepped back from the table as Okafor came through the door, and for a moment the two women looked at each other across the gurney and the blood and the still alarming monitor, and Okafor looked at what had been done and then looked at Evelyn with an expression that asked a lot of questions simultaneously. "He stabilized," Evelyn said. "Tension pneumo, needle decompressed, chest tube placed, bilateral breath sounds. He needs the MAC." Okafor was already at the table. "Who did the tube?" "I did." A pause, not a hesitant one, and assessing one. "Good placement," Okafor said, and she said it the way surgeons said things when they meant them, without decoration. Then, "I've got it from here." Evelyn nodded and stepped out of the trauma bay. The ER looked like a photograph of a scene someone had been trying to stage for a drama. Staff positioned against walls or clustered at the nurse's station. The soldiers occupying the space near the ambulance bay doors with the patience of people accustomed to waiting. And in the center of all of it, Linda Mercer, holding her tablet like a shield, and more behind her, arms crossed. And between them and Evelyn, about 15 feet of linoleum and 6 months of accumulated condescension. Linda's face had the expression of someone trying to hold several emotions in one container that wasn't quite big enough. She looked at Evelyn's blood-soaked scrubs, then at the commander who had followed Evelyn out of the trauma bay, then back at Evelyn. "You need to come with me," Linda said. "In a minute. Now, Drake, you performed and authorized." She saved his life. The commander's voice was level, not loud, the kind of voice that didn't need to be loud. "In about 4 minutes, with compromised equipment. Whatever your protocol says about authorization, this is a DoD priority case, and that patient is alive because of what just happened in that room." Linda said, her jaw. "This is my ER. I determine." "Ma'am." He said it politely, precisely in the way that military officers sometimes said things to make it clear that politeness was a choice they were making. "I understand your position. Right now, I need to speak with Nurse Drake. After that, we can discuss whatever administrative process you need to run." The tablet in Linda's hands made a small, sharp sound. She'd gripped it too hard. Evelyn looked at Moore. He was watching the commander with an expression she'd never seen on his face before, which was the expression of someone who had confidently occupied a room for a very long time and was only now beginning to understand that the room's furniture had been rearranged. "Drake," the commander said, turning to her. "Can we find somewhere to sit?" She looked around the ER, at the staff who were watching her, at Linda, still holding the tablet, at the soldiers near the door, patient as landmarks. "Break," she said, down the hall. He nodded. They walked behind them. She heard Linda's voice again. Lower now, directed at Moore or Travers or someone. "I want documentation of every step she took from the moment those doors opened, and I want legal on the phone in 10 minutes. And the sound of it followed her down the corridor like weather. In the break room, the commander sat down across from her, at the small table with the wobbly leg that someone had fixed 3 times with different methods and gotten wrong each time. He put his hands flat on the table and looked at her. "You look tired," he said. "I am tired." "How long have you been here?" "Briar Falls." 6 weeks. He nodded slowly. "Before that, Pueblo. Before that, Denver. Before that," she stopped. "You know where?" "Before that?" "Yeah." He was quiet for a moment. "We've been looking for about 4 months." She felt something move in her chest, not quite surprised. She'd known in the abstract that this was a possibility. She'd taken care to reduce it, the redacted file, the careful references, the distance. But she'd also known that the people you'd been in the field with were not the kind of people who stopped looking when they wanted to find you. "Why?" she said. "Because Riker is the reason your file got buried in the first place. And when his team's medic took around 3 weeks ago on an extraction op, the team said there was one person they'd trust to." He stopped. "Reorganized. Because you are the best trauma medic we have ever worked with. And because that man in the O right now would be dead on a gurney in a county ER if we hadn't found you." Evelyn looked at her hands. They were clean now. She'd washed them before coming out of the trauma bay, but she could feel the phantom of blood on them the way she always could after something like this. "The man on the gurney," she said. "That's Riker? What's left of him?" "He took shrapnel in a bad exfil. 2 punctures left side. The chest wound was the worst. His medic stabilized him enough for transport, but it wasn't." He shook his head. "It wasn't enough. He'll make it through surgery," she said. "Okafor is good, if the 2 bought him enough time to get to the table." "It did." "Evelyn." He said her real name carefully like he was handling something fragile. "I know why you left. I know what the last tour did. We all knew it wasn't another stop. Nobody blamed you for leaving. I know, she said, but you've been hiding in supply rooms for 6 weeks. She looked at the wobbly table leg. Someone had used electrical tape on it this time. It wasn't going to hold. That was the plan, she said. How's it going? She almost laughed. Almost. Apparently not as well as I thought. Down the hallway, she could hear the sound of the ER continuing to function around the disruption. The monitors, the PA, someone's cart rolling across the floor. Normal sounds, hospital sounds, the sounds of a place that had its routines and intended to get back to them. And beneath all of that, underneath every ordinary sound of an ordinary Tuesday morning in Briar Falls, Colorado, she could hear Linda's voice in the word legal, and the particular silence that meant more was thinking about how this affected him. The commander was watching her. He had the patience of someone who had learned to wait for people to finish thinking. She's going to file something, Evelyn said.
Yeah, the charge nurse. She's going to call it unauthorized treatment, maybe a liability issue. She can call it whatever she wants. He said it without heat, factually. We have footage of every second from the moment we came through those doors. Every decision you made is on record. Evelyn went very still. Helmet cams, he said. All 8 of the team, plus our dispatch records from the moment we got the call on Riker's location and coded it as a priority medical retrieval. Every communication, every timestamp. He paused. We didn't come here unprepared. She thought about that, about what it meant, about the 6 weeks of supply carts and redacted files, and Linda's dismissals, and Moore's compressions that were too shallow, and the way Trevor's had looked at her credentials like they were suspicious just for existing. She thought about the man named Rideacre, who was currently on a surgical table because she'd placed a chest tube in 4 minutes with whatever was on hand, and who would be dead if she hadn't walked out from behind that supply cart. What do you want? She said. Right now, I want you to come with me and talk to the team. They want to see you. After that, he spread his hands. That's your call. I'm not here to drag you back into anything. I just needed to find you today for him. She looked at him for a long moment. Outside the break room, down the corridor, the sound of Linda's voice had sharpened in that particular way. That meant she'd gotten someone on the phone who she thought would help her. Evelyn stood up. Okay, she said. Let's go. The team was in the ambulance bay. They'd moved the Blackhawks to the hospital's north parking structure. Somebody had made a call, cleared the upper level, redirected civilian traffic, and the soldiers had pulled back from the ER entrance to give the staff room to breathe, but they hadn't gone far. 8 of them, sitting or standing along the exterior wall of the bay in the particular way that military people rested when rest wasn't really rest. Alert, positioned, watching exits. When Evelyn came through the bay doors with the commander, 3 of them stood up immediately. She recognized 2 faces.
The third was younger, new since she'd left, and he was watching her with the expression of someone who'd heard a story enough times that the actual person in it had taken on a slightly mythological quality. She'd seen that look before too, and she didn't like it any better now. Easy, she said to all 3, and none of them specifically. The tallest one, Specialist Donovan Rhee, whom she remembered because he'd once held a field dressing against his own shoulder while she'd worked on the man beside him without complaint for 11 minutes, let out a breath that sounded like it had been held since they'd landed. You look different, he said. I work in a hospital. No, I mean, he gestured vaguely at her. Her scrubs, the building, different. Smaller, said the one next to him. Petro, older. She remembered him from a night in a Ford operating base where the generator had failed, and she'd read a chest x-ray by flashlight. He meant it as an observation, not a criticism, but it landed somewhere uncomfortable regardless. I'm not smaller, she said. I just stopped taking up space I didn't need. Neither of them had an answer for that. The commander, she still didn't know his name, which felt strange for a person she'd now spent 20 minutes in close proximity with, moved to stand beside her. His name is Mason Ridge, he said, apparently reading something in her face. We worked together after you left. Riker's team pulled me in as coordinator. Ridge, she said. Commander Ridge, if we're being formal, which I'm told I should be in civilian facilities. The faint edge of something that wasn't quite a smile. We're not being formal. How long has Riker been running with this unit? 2 years since the transition. Ridge paused. He requested you 3 weeks ago. When he got the notification, his medic was down.
Specifically you. That's why we started looking. Evelyn looked at the bay doors, the hospital beyond them. The ordinary Tuesday morning she'd pulled an extraordinary thing out of, and was now apparently standing on the other side of. The adrenaline was doing what adrenaline did when the emergency stopped. It was settling into her joints like sediment, leaving behind a particular exhausted clarity. He didn't know where I was,
she said. No, it took us a while. Rage folded his arms. You covered your tracks pretty well. Not well enough. You were never going to be well enough for what we have in our resources. He said it matter-of-factly without apology. But we weren't looking to disrupt your life, Evelyn. We were looking because a man was going to die without specific intervention, and he deserved to have the best shot available. She processed that. The logic of it was clean. The logic of it was also the same logic that had taken her into rooms she hadn't planned to be in more times than she could count. And she recognized the shape of it the way you recognized a road you'd driven in the dark. Not by seeing it clearly, but by feeling the turns. He survived the bay, she said finally. The rest is Okafor. Yeah. Ridge glanced toward the hospital. She any good? Good enough. Reese had his hands in his pockets, which she remembered was what he did when he had something to say and was editing himself. She looked at him directly. What? Nothing. Just. He pulled one hand out, rubbed the back of his neck. It's good to see you working, that's all. I was working before you got here. Stocking shelves, restocking trauma supplies. She said it more sharply than she'd intended, and the sharpness surprised her a little. She hadn't realized she was irritated about it until it came out. Which is a job that matters in a trauma bay in case that needs explaining. Reese raised both hands, acknowledging the correction. Petro, slightly behind him, looked at the ground. Reach watched the exchange without comment, which she suspected was something he did a lot. Watched and filed. He had that quality. The kind of person who collected information about people the way other people collected objects. Not to use it against them, but because understanding the room was how he functioned. The bay radio crackled. One of the soldiers, the young one she didn't recognize, touched his earpiece and then looked at Ridge. Or says they're 40 minutes in. Okafor's team is stabilized. Ridge nodded to Evelyn.
We'll wait. She thought about going back inside, about Linda's phone call to legal, about Moore, whose face she hadn't been able to read and kept returning to. The arms crossed, the silence. Something in his reaction had been different from the usual dismissal. She'd placed it eventually, driving the thought through everything else in the last hour. It wasn't anger. It was the look of someone who'd made an assessment and gotten it wrong, and was in the early, uncomfortable stage of knowing it. She wasn't sure that was better. I need to go deal with something, she said. Ridge looked at her. The charge nurse. She's going to escalate this letter. That's easier to say when it's not your nursing license. She kept her voice level, not combative, just honest. Whatever you have on your helmet cams, I still have to work here or somewhere. I can't have an unauthorized treatment filing on my record. Without it, it won't stick, Ridge said. You don't know that. I know what our legal team looks like when they mobilize, he said. And they mobilized about 40 minutes ago when we filed the priority retrieval documentation with the DOD and your hospital's administrative contacts. He paused, letting that settle. This wasn't a spontaneous decision coming here. We prepared for the institutional friction. She stared at him. You prepared for Linda? We prepared for the kind of response a military team walking into a civilian ER tends to generate. Something in his expression was carefully neutral. The fact that there's a specific individual generating that response is specific, she said. Very.
Behind her, the bay doors opened. Priya came out, still in her scrubs, carrying 2 paper cups of coffee, with the resigned efficiency of someone who decided that contributing something tangible was better than standing around the break room with the rest of the staff, who were either talking too much or not at all. She stopped when she saw the group of soldiers. Then, with the particular determination of someone who decided to commit to a decision, she continued walking until she was close enough to hand one of the cups to Evelyn. It's terrible, Priya said. The machine's been broken for a week. Linda put in the repair request and then apparently forgot about it. Thank you, Evelyn said. Priya hovered for a moment, then to the group of soldiers in general. Does anyone need? She held up the second cup with a slightly helpless gesture. Reese accepted it with a sincerity that visibly surprised her. Thank you, seriously. Priya looked at Evelyn. Something in her face had shifted from the compliant anxiety Evelyn had read in her for weeks, the face of someone who'd been navigating Linda's system long enough that keeping her head down had become a reflex rather than a choice. She's in her office, Priya said quietly. She called Dr. Hargrove. Hargrove, she chief of medicine. Evelyn hadn't had many interactions with him. He operated on a floor above most of what she did, but she'd formed impressions, careful, political, the kind of administrator who made decisions based on what would look best in documentation, rather than what was actually right. Not a bad man necessarily, just a man who'd learned to protect the institution first.
Is she filing a formal complaint? Evelyn said.
Priya hesitated. I don't know exactly. I heard her say unauthorized procedure and liability exposure, and then she closed the door. Evelyn drank the terrible coffee. It was objectively bad, bitter and slightly stale, and made with water that hadn't been hot enough. It also gave her hands something to do. Okay, she said. Evelyn, Priya said her name the way people said names when they were practicing the courage to say something else. What you did in there, I've been in trauma rotations for 3 years. I've worked with Dr. Moore and 2 attending surgeons and the flight medics who come in with the air ambulance sometimes. She stopped, reorganized. I've never seen anyone work like that. The compliment landed somewhere tender, not because she needed it exactly. She'd long since stopped requiring external confirmation for what she knew she could do, but because Priya had been in that room and seen it cleanly without the filters of hierarchy or assumption, and that was different from the admiration of people who'd heard about it secondhand. You were good in there too, Evelyn said. You anticipated. That matters. Priya blinked like she hadn't expected the sentence to turn back in her direction. Then she nodded once and went back inside. Ridge was watching the door close. She seems like a good one. She is. Evelyn turned the cup in her hands. She's been in that department long enough that the system's made her smaller too. She'll grow back when someone stops sitting on her. The implication of that, the someone, hung in the Colorado morning air, which was clear and cold the way Briar Falls mornings were in the shoulder seasons, and neither of them spoke into it. Inside, things were already moving. Evelyn didn't see it happen in real time. She was in the ambulance bay when Dr. Hargrove made his way to Linda's office, and the two of them were inside for 20 minutes with the door closed, which meant whatever was being decided in the particular language of administrators who were trying to determine how to frame something before the frame escaped their control. She'd seen this dynamic before, not in hospitals but in command structures, in debrief rooms, in the spaces between incidents where the institution gathered itself and tried to decide what story it was going to tell.
What she didn't know, standing in the bay with her terrible coffee and Ridge's quiet company, was that 3 things were happening simultaneously inside the building that would, within the next 2 hours, completely restructure the situation she'd been living inside for 6 weeks. The first was Garrett. Garrett, the older nurse who'd been in the trauma bay with her, who'd had the chest tube ready before she asked, who'd been at North Haven for 14 years and had the institutional memory of a man who'd watched things happen and kept his observations private because the system had taught him that private was safer. Garrett, who had apparently decided that the weight of what he'd watched this morning, and as it turned out, the weight of what he'd watched for the past 6 weeks, had exceeded what he was willing to carry silently. He went to Dr. Hargrove's assistant before Hargrove had finished with Linda. He asked for 5 minutes. He got 10 because the assistant took one look at his face and cleared the calendar. What he said in those 10 minutes, Evelyn didn't know yet. She'd learn it later in pieces, the way you learn things that happened in rooms you weren't in. The second thing was the footage. Ridge had mentioned the helmet cams. What he hadn't mentioned, what he'd been specific about not mentioning, she understood later, because he'd been letting the institution's position clarified before introducing information that would change it, was that the footage had already been transmitted, not just recorded, transmitted to the DoD liaison, who'd been brought in when this became a priority retrieval, and from there to the hospital's compliance office, because the DoD had specific protocols for medical interventions in civilian facilities during priority operations, and those protocols included documentation that the civilian facility received whether they asked for it or not. Someone in the compliance office had watched 43 minutes of high-definition footage from 8 angles before Linda finished her conversation with Hargrove.
The third thing was Moore. Caleb Moore was not a man who admitted mistakes. He had built his entire professional identity on a particular version of himself. Competent, authoritative, the person in the room who knew most, and that version had no error state. When the error state appeared anyway, because reality was indifferent to professional identity, his system's response was to recategorize the error as someone else's. Except that today, something had stopped working in that system. He'd stood at the door of Trauma 1 and watched Evelyn work. He'd watched with the specific attention of someone who understood what he was seeing, who had the training to recognize technique, to read the decision tree behind each intervention, to understand how much certainty you needed to move at that speed with those stakes. And what he'd seen had not been luck. It had not been adrenaline and instinct and getting away with it. It had been someone who had done this before many times, under conditions that made North Haven's trauma bay look like a practice simulation. He went to find Priya. He found her at the nurse's station updating charts, and he stood in front of her for a moment in a way that she later described as like he was looking for something on the floor and couldn't find it. "How long has Drake been at this hospital?" he said. 6 weeks. Priya didn't look up. "Since October, has she stopped? Have you seen her work trauma before today?" Priya set her pen down. She looked up at him with the expression of someone who was choosing their words with the awareness that the choice mattered. "She hasn't been assigned to trauma," she said. "She's been on supply rotation." The pause that followed was the kind that contained a reckoning. "Supply rotation?" Moore repeated. "Since she arrived." He left without saying anything else, which was its own kind of sentence. Evelyn had been back inside for 10 minutes when Hera found her. He came down the corridor with the measured pace of an administrator who had spent years learning how to walk toward difficult conversations with the appearance of calm. He was 60, heavyset, with a white coat that fit better than it used to, and the face of a man who'd been sleeping poorly. He didn't look like someone who'd made a decision. He looked like someone who'd had a decision made for him and was adapting to it. "Nurse Drake," he said, "do you have a moment?" Around them, the ER continued to exist. Monitors, carts, the PA calling a doctor to radiology.
The ordinary machine of it, grinding on. "Yes," she said. He guided her to a consultation room. Not the break room, a different one, smaller, with 2 chairs and a table, and nothing on the walls except a clock and a mounted hand sanitizer dispenser. The room hospitals used when they needed to tell someone something and wanted the conversation contained. He closed the door, sat down. She sat across from him. "I've been made aware," he began, and then stopped, resetting. "I want to be direct with you. I've just reviewed the initial documentation from the Department of Defense regarding this morning's incident, and I've spoken with Mr. Garrett from your team, who had some things to say." He put his hands together on the table. "I'm going to need your file. I'm aware my file is limited. The DoD has offered to provide a supplementary summary to our HR office, with your consent." She looked at him. The clock on the wall ticked. It was 10:43 a.m. She'd been at work for 4 hours and 43 minutes and was sitting in a consult room being asked whether she consented to having her history revealed to an institution that had spent 6 weeks treating her like furniture. "What kind of summary?" she said. "Your service record, the relevant portions." He paused. "I understand there are parts that remain classified. Those would stay classified, but the nature of your role, your training, your qualifications, your operational experience in trauma settings." He paused again. "I think it would benefit the conversation we need to have." "The conversation about whether Linda Mercer's unauthorized treatment filing is going to move forward," Evelyn said. Hargrove looked at the table. "That filing is being reviewed. How's it looking?" "A beat. It's looking like something that doesn't have legs," he said quietly, which was the most direct thing she suspected he'd said to anyone in years. She thought about the consent question, about what it meant to let the redacted file become less redacted, about the apartment with the empty bookshelf, and the morning runs, and Wren's office with the cedar smell, and the 2 years she'd spent building the architecture of a smaller life. The smaller life was already over. She'd known it the moment she walked out from behind the supply cart. "Go ahead," she said. Hargrove nodded. He had the decency to look like what he was doing cost something. They were in the consult room for another 20 minutes. He asked questions carefully, the way a person asks questions when they were already adjusting their expectations with each answer. She gave him what she could, and when she couldn't, she said so, and he accepted the limits without pushing. By the end of it, she had a reasonable picture of where she stood. The filing was dead. The DoD documentation had effectively preempted any liability framing Linda had been building, and Hargrove was in the early stages of something she read as institutional regret, not for Evelyn's benefit, but because he was the kind of administrator who would eventually, given enough pressure and evidence, do the right thing out of self-preservation, if not virtue. It wasn't inspiring, but it was functional. She came out of the consult room to find Ridge standing in the corridor with his arms folded, and the expression of someone who'd received news and was waiting to find out which kind. "He's out of surgery," Ridge said. "Everything else stopped. Riker, 40 minutes ago. Okafor said it went well. He's in recovery." Ridge's voice had changed. Not by much, but enough. The professional control thinning at the edges to let something genuine through. She said whoever placed the chest tube bought him exactly the window he needed. Evelyn stood in the corridor of North Haven Medical Center, with the clock on the wall at the end of the hall reading 11:08 a.m., and the ordinary sounds of the hospital arranging themselves around her, and she took one slow breath and then another, and she let Riker being alive be real for a moment, before she said anything else. "Good," she said. That was all. It was enough. Ridge watched her. "You want to see him?" "Not yet. He's in recovery. He doesn't need." "He asked for you when he came out of anesthesia." Ridge paused. That was the first thing he said. Apparently the nurses weren't sure what to do with it. She almost smiled. "What did he say exactly?" "According to Okafor, he opened his eyes, looked at the ceiling, and said, 'Tell Viper I'm not dead yet.' Then he went back to sleep." This time she did smile. It was small, and she directed it at the floor. And it was over quickly, but it was real. "Okay," she said. "Give him an hour."
What happened in that hour was the part she hadn't anticipated, because she'd been focused on the immediate. Riker, the filing Harov, and hadn't been tracking the lateral movements happening in the rest of the institution. The way that stories spread in hospitals with the specific velocity of information in contained environments, where everyone worked closely, and secrets had a structural disadvantage. The staff knew pieces. They'd seen the soldiers come in. They'd seen Evelyn walk to the gurney. They'd been in the hallway or at the nurse's station, or visible through doorways during various parts of the morning. And what they knew was assembled from those fragments into different versions that were true in different proportions. But Garrett, in his 10 minutes with Harov's assistant, had apparently been specific and thorough, and whatever he'd said had come back into the department with the weight of testimony. Travers found her at the supply card. She'd gone back to the supply card, partly because the work still needed doing, and partly because she needed something to do with her hands and her nervous system, and stood beside her for a moment without speaking. She looked at him sideways.
I said something, he said finally, about your credentials a few weeks ago, the gap in employment. He had his arms crossed in the way people cross their arms when they were uncomfortable and wanted to look like they weren't. I shouldn't have said it like that. You were making an observation. I was implying something, and I was wrong. He shifted his weight. That's, he wanted to say. It wasn't an apology exactly. It was the thing before an apology, the part where a person acknowledged the shape of the wrong before they could find the word for it. She'd seen it enough times to know what it was. Okay, she said. Okay, I heard you. She counted a row of IV bags and made a note. That's what I've got right now. He left. It wasn't a warm moment. It wasn't resolved. Real things didn't resolve in one conversation in a hospital corridor, and she wasn't going to manufacture warmth she didn't have. But he'd come. He'd said the thing. It was something. More was harder. She didn't see him coming. She was in the hallway near the trauma bay, heading toward recovery to see Riker, when he appeared from around the corner, and they were suddenly 3 feet apart, with nowhere graceful to go. He looked like he hadn't slept, which was interesting given that it was barely noon. He had the particular worn quality of someone who'd been thinking very hard about something for several hours and hadn't resolved it. Drake, he said. Dr. Moore. A pause. The hallway wasn't empty. There were people moving at the other end, the background traffic of a hospital in motion, but nobody was close enough to be part of whatever this was. The code, he said, 3 weeks ago. Sykes. I remember you were right about the compressions.
He said it like he was removing something carefully from somewhere it had been embedded. I'd adjusted, but I'd been... Yes, you were right. She waited. I should have. He stopped, restarted. The way I responded was wrong. Yes, she agreed. Not combative, not forgiving either, just accurate. He looked at her for a moment with the face of a man who'd expected either more resistance or more absolution and received neither. Then he nodded once and stepped aside to let her pass. She passed. She thought, walking, that Moore would probably be fine. He was 34, with a functioning brain and enough training to know what she'd done in that trauma bay this morning, and that knowledge was going to do something to him whether he wanted it to or not. He might not become someone different, but he might become slightly less certain of the version of himself he'd been performing, and that small erosion could, over time, make him better at the job, or it could calcify into resentment. She genuinely didn't know. She had enough to carry without predicting his arc. Riker was awake. I was in a private recovery room. Ridge had arranged that, she suspected, with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd been arranging things for people in difficult situations for long enough that it was automatic. And he was pale under the hospital light, with drainage tubes and monitoring equipment, and the specific diminished look of a large, capable person knocked horizontal by their own body. His left side was immobilized. His face was a color that wasn't quite right, but his eyes were open and tracking, and when she came through the door, they found her immediately. There she is, he said. His voice was rough, post-anesthesia, dragged up from somewhere underwater. There you are. She pulled a chair to the side of the bed. How do you feel? Like someone put a drainage tube in my chest. Someone did. Was it you? The tube? Yes. The surgery was Dr. Okapour.
He absorbed that. Good surgeon. Very, very. Okay. He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again. Ridge says, "You're working supply here. I was supply." The word came out with a texture that wasn't quite disbelief, something more specific. Evelyn Drake, supply. I'm aware of how it sounds.
You know what I was thinking about on the bird when I was... He paused. The sentence was too long for where he was. When I was going in and out? You know what I kept thinking? Don't. That you are somewhere, Riker, somewhere, doing something that had nothing to do with what you're actually for. She looked at him. At the monitors. At the drainage tube doing its quiet work. You just had major thoracic surgery, she said. Save the speech. I prepared it in advance. His mouth moved towards something like a smile. I had a lot of time to prepare. 40 minutes in the air. 40 very long minutes. His eyes closed again, heavier this time. You're not going back to the supply cart. You don't get to decide that. No, he agreed, fading. But something happened this morning that might. She sat with him until he was fully asleep, which took about 4 minutes. She listened to his breathing even out, and watched the monitor settle into the slow rhythms of someone whose body had been through something significant and was now doing the serious work of repair. The room was quiet in the specific way that recovery rooms were quiet. Not peaceful exactly, but purposeful. The quiet of process. She thought about what he'd said.
Something happened this morning that might. He wasn't wrong. She'd felt it when she walked out of the consult room with Hargrove, when Travers had found her at the supply cart, when Moore had stepped aside in the hallway. The shape of something was changing. The architecture of how she existed inside this institution was shifting in ways that couldn't be shifted back, and she was still deciding how she felt about that. The smaller life was over. She'd built it carefully, and it had served its purpose, and now it was over. What came next was a question she didn't have an answer to yet. She left Riker sleeping and walked back down the corridor toward the ER. And she was almost to the nurse's station when she heard it. Linda's voice, elevated, coming from Hargrove's office, the door of which was apparently not fully closed because the words were clear enough to understand, even from 15 feet away in a noisy corridor. You cannot simply defer to military documentation over our internal protocols. This is my department. I have a responsibility to... Hargrove's response was lower, not fully audible. Do not care what the footage shows. That woman violated. More of Hargrove still not audible, but the tone was different from what she'd heard in the consult room. Flatter, more resolved. Then Linda again, and her voice had changed, the elevation dropping into something colder and more precise, which was actually more alarming than the raised version, because it indicated she'd made a decision about how to handle this. Then I want to speak with legal directly, not the DoD's legal, our legal. Before anything else happens, I want our team looking at every decision made in that trauma bay today. And I want Drake's full employment file on my desk by end of shift. Evelyn stood in the corridor and listened to the silence after Linda's last sentence, which was the silence of Hargrove either agreeing or not. Then she heard Riddige's voice, not from Hargrove's office, from behind her. The full employment file, he said quietly at her shoulder. He'd come up without sound, which was its own kind of information about how he moved through spaces. That's going to be interesting. She turned. He was close enough that she could keep her voice low. Why? Because your full employment file, he said, includes things that are going to require Linda Mercer's security clearance to read. He paused. Which she doesn't have. She stared at him.
Actual file is something different. And if Linda Mercer files a formal request for documentation that's above her clearance level, she's going to trigger a review process that is going to involve people at a pay grade significantly higher than a hospital administrator in Briar Falls, Colorado. He let that sit. People who are not going to look kindly at a charge nurse attempting to bring an unauthorized treatment action against a decorated combat medic who just saved a DoD priority asset. Evelyn processed this. The clock on the wall at the end of the corridor said 12:31 p.m. You knew this might happen, she said. I prepared for the range of outcomes, including Linda escalating. Linda escalating was the most likely outcome. His expression was even. People who've been operating from a position of unchallenged authority for 11 years tend to escalate when the authority is challenged. It's predictable. So you came in prepared to pat? I came in to retrieve a wounded soldier, he said.
Everything else is a consequence of existing systems doing what existing systems do when they encounter information that doesn't fit their current model. In Hardgrove's office, the voices had stopped. There was a silence that was the sound of a decision being made or deferred. Evelyn looked at the door, at the frosted glass panel beside it, through which she could see the blurred shapes of two people, one of them behind a desk, one of them standing. "She's going to file it," Evelyn said. "Even if Hardgrove tells her not to, she's going to." "I know," Ridge said.
And when she does, yes. They stood in the corridor of North Haven Medical Center while the hospital moved around them. And Evelyn Drake understood, in the particular way you understood things when they became inevitable, that the quiet she'd been building for 2 years was about to become very, very loud. The door to Harrow's office opened. Linda came out first. She was carrying her tablet, and her face had the closed, deliberate expression of someone who had lost an argument and was already mapping the route around it. She looked at the corridor. She looked at Evelyn. She looked at Ridge. Something moved across her face that Evelyn couldn't fully name. Not embarrassment, not exactly, but the cousin of it, the thing that happened when a person's certainty of their own position encountered specific evidence that the position was less solid than they'd understood. She kept walking, past Evelyn, past Ridge, back toward the nurse's station. Harrow appeared in the doorway. He looked at Evelyn with the expression of a man who was recategorizing something in real time and finding the process uncomfortable. "Nurse Drake," he said, "I think we should talk about your placement going forward." It was such a reasonable administrative sentence, such a carefully framed version of, "Everything has changed, and I don't know how to say that yet." Evelyn opened her mouth. Her pager went off. Not her regular pager. Her hospital-issued one had a routine sound she'd cataloged in the first week. This was the emergency frequency, the one that meant all available trauma staff to the bay. And it went off simultaneously with 3 other pagers in the corridor, and the PA system overhead announcing a mass casualty event for incoming ETA 6 minutes. And for a half second, the world was very still. Then Evelyn Drake, who had spent 6 weeks being told to stay out of trauma, turned toward the ER, and she ran. The 6 minutes felt like 2. North Haven's trauma bay transformed the way emergency departments transformed when the numbers exceeded capacity. Not elegantly, not according to the laminated protocol cards clipped to every station, but through the particular organized violence of people who knew their jobs fighting the math of too many bodies and not enough hands.
4 incoming meant 4 simultaneous assessments, 4 triage decisions, 4 sets of competing priorities arriving in the same physical space within minutes of each other. Evelyn hit the bay doors moving and didn't stop. Prio was already pulling a crash cart. Garrett was on the phone, his voice low and fast, calling for backup from the floor above. 2 other nurses she recognized from the rotation, Marcus and a woman named Delgado, were setting up lines at stations 2 and 3. The charge desk was a wall of sound, radio, phone, PA, the approaching wail of sirens from the ambulance bay outside. Linda was there. She'd gotten there first, which was a fact Evelyn noted and filed. Whatever else Linda was, she moved toward emergencies. She was at the center of the bay directing traffic with the clipped authority of 11 years. And when Evelyn came through the doors, she looked at her for exactly 1 second before looking away. "Station 4, Linda said. Not to Evelyn specifically, to the room. Evelyn went to Station 4. The first ambulance hit the bay doors at 12:37. "Highway accident, semi versus 2 passenger vehicles," the paramedic was saying, still moving, talking fast. "Multiple ejections, 1 pediatric." The doors opened and the gurney came through, and Evelyn was already reading the patient before the wheels locked. Male, 50s, GCS dropping, left arm compromised, head lacerate that had bled significantly but wasn't the priority. The real problem was the abdomen, distended and rigid in the way that meant internal hemorrhage, and the clock on that had already been running for however long it had taken to extract him from the wreck. "Abdomen," she said to Marcus, who was across the station from her. "I see it. Large bore IV, 2 of them. Get me Econeg and call surgery now." "He's going to need. Surgery's already been called," Garrett said from across the bay.
Okafor's team is still in the O. Of course they were. Riker's surgery had finished, but the O had to turn over, which took time they didn't have. "Who else is available?" Dr. Vasquez was paged. ETA 12 minutes. 12 minutes. She looked at the abdomen, at the pressure dropping on the monitor, at the patient, who was a man with a gray beard and someone's name tattooed on his forearm in script she couldn't read upside down, and who was going somewhere she couldn't follow him if she couldn't hold the line. "Get me a fast probe," she said. A pause for Marcus, brief, the kind that asked a question without asking it. "Now," she said. He got the probe. She ran the bedside ultrasound herself. 4 views, less than 60 seconds. And what she saw in the abdomen confirmed what the rigidity had suggested. Free fluid, significant.
the echo dark pooling around the liver that meant hepatic laceration or worse. He was bleeding into his belly, and the rate was not compatible with waiting 12 minutes. He needs the O. She said get Vasquez on the phone directly, not the page. The second gurney came through while she was talking. Pediatric, the paramedic hadn't been wrong. A girl, maybe 9, who had the specific gray stillness of a child whose body had absorbed more than it was built for. She was breathing, that was the first thing. But she was altered, eyes half open, and there was a deformity in her right leg that was obvious, and a mechanism of injury that suggested things less obvious. Linda was at that gurney. For a split second, across the noise and the motion of the bay, Evelyn and Linda's eyes met. Linda looked down at the child. "Collar, secondary trauma survey. Get me pediatric dosing on the board," Linda said. And she said it right. She said it correctly and quickly. And whatever else was true about Linda Mercer, Evelyn watched her work this case with her hands and her brain pointed in the right direction, and understood that the thing making Linda impossible was not incompetence. It was something else. Something that only activated when the threat wasn't a dying patient, but a living person who challenged her authority. The third and fourth ambulances arrived together.
The bay hit capacity in under 4 minutes, which meant every station was occupied, every available nurse was moving, and Moore, who had appeared from somewhere, still in his coat, still looking like a man carrying a conversation he hadn't finished, was at Station 2 calling orders that were, she noted, exactly right. His hands were doing what hands should do in this situation, and his voice had the register of someone who'd stopped thinking about anything except the patient. She filed that too. Her patient, the man with the gray beard, had stabilized marginally on the fluids, enough to not be dying in the next 4 minutes, but the floor on that estimate was soft. Vasquez was on the phone now. Garrett had him, and she could hear fragments of the conversation. Hepatic lac, suspect, grade 3 or higher, BP responding but not holding. And then Garrett was at her elbow. "Vasquez wants to know if you can get him to 8 minutes. She looked at the monitor. "Tell Vasquez I can try." What that looked like the next 8 minutes was the kind of medicine that didn't translate to any format that made it look like what it was. It was watching numbers and making adjustments, and anticipating the drop before it happened, and being wrong once the pressure went further south than she'd predicted faster, and correcting, and the correction working barely, and the patient's body doing what bodies sometimes did when they were deciding, and her hands doing everything she knew how to do to tip that decision in the right direction. Vasquez came through the bay doors at 12:51. He was younger than she'd expected, early 40s, compact, moving like someone who was always slightly late to wherever he was going. He took one look at her patient, one look at the ultrasound images on the screen, and looked at Evelyn. "Good read," he said. "Let's move." They moved the gurney toward the elevator with a speed that was just short of running.
Evelyn on one side, a transport tech on the other, Vasquez talking to his team through his earpiece as they went. And in the moment between the bay and the corridor, in the 3 seconds when they passed through the doorway and the noise of the trauma bay was behind them and the quieter urgency of the corridor was ahead, she was aware of Linda watching, not managing, not directing, just watching Evelyn move that gurney toward the elevator, watching her go where 6 weeks of supply rotation had been designed to keep her from going. And the expression on Linda's face was something that had no clean name. Evelyn didn't stop to read it. Upstairs, outside the OR, Vasquez's team took the patient. That was where her jurisdiction ended, at the OR threshold, the handoff point. And she gave the report in the fast, compressed shorthand of emergency medicine. Every number, every intervention, the timeline, the imaging, and Vasquez listened with his eyes already moving toward the room where his team was prepping. "You work here?" he said when she finished. "Yes." "What's your name?" "Drake." "Evelyn Drake." He nodded once, the nod of someone cataloging information. "You did good work downstairs." And then he was through the OR doors, and they closed behind him, and she was standing in a corridor outside a surgical suite at 12:58 p.m. on a Tuesday that had started with a supply cart and a clipboard. She stood there for a moment, longer than she should have, probably. Then she took the elevator back down. The trauma bay was quieting. Not quiet. Never quiet after something like that. But the acute phase was over. The pediatric patient had been stabilized and was being transferred to the pediatric ICU upstairs. The third and fourth patients from the accident had both been managed and were on their way to imaging. Marcus was cleaning Station 4. Delgado was on the phone. The ordinary machine of the place was asserting itself again over the disorder. Moore was at the charge desk writing. He didn't look up when she walked in. Garrett did. He gave her a look that she read his affirmation. Not effusive, not performed, just the clean acknowledgement of a person who'd been in the same room doing the same work and knew what the work had been. Linda was at her station. She was writing too, or appearing to write, her eyes on her tablet,
her posture the posture of a person who had decided how to hold themselves in a changed situation.
Whatever the expression had been in the doorway, Evelyn still couldn't name it. It was gone now, replaced with something more controlled, more decided. Evelyn went to Station 4 and began the process of restocking what had been used. It was 4 minutes before Linda walked up beside her. She didn't lead with anything. She stood close enough to be speaking to Evelyn and far enough to be plausibly speaking to the room, which was a position Evelyn recognized as someone who hadn't committed yet to whatever they were about to do. "Hargrove's calling an emergency staff meeting," Linda said. "End of shift." "I know," Evelyn said, although she hadn't known. "He's going to want to talk about role assignments." Linda's voice was doing a complicated thing, controlled, but with an edge under the control that wasn't quite anger, more like something that had been dislodged and hadn't found where to settle yet. "The DoD documentation is being reviewed by administration." "I know that too." A silence. Evelyn counted suture kits without looking up. "You should have told someone what your background was," Linda said finally, "when you were hired." Evelyn set down the suture kit. She turned and looked at Linda directly, which she hadn't done in 6 weeks. "Not like this, not with nothing deflecting it. Would it have changed how you treated me?" Linda held her gaze for 2 seconds. 3. She walked away without answering. Evelyn watched her go. She turned back to the supply cart, and she was reaching for the next row of inventory when her phone buzzed. Not her pager, her personal phone, the one she kept in her scrub pocket, a number she didn't recognize. Colorado area code. She answered. Nurse Drake, a voice she didn't know. Female, businesslike, the specific register of someone who'd made this kind of call before. "This is Sandra Voss, Office of the Inspector General, Department of Defense. We've been reviewing the documentation from today's retrieval operation at North Haven Medical Center." A pause that was not friendly. "We've also been reviewing some additional documentation that came to our attention this afternoon regarding the employment conditions at that facility over the past 6 weeks. Evelyn was very still. "We'd like to discuss some things with you," Voss said, "and separately with your hospital's administration this afternoon if possible." Down the hall, Hargram's office door opened.
Linda was going in, and behind Linda, following her inside with the brisk movement of someone who had come with a specific purpose and intended to complete it, was a woman Evelyn had never seen before. Suited, dark coat, carrying a briefcase, and she looked like no one who belonged in a hospital. Evelyn stared at the closed door. "Miss Drake," Voss said in her ear, "are you available to meet?" The door opened again immediately, and this time Harrove came out, and his face was the face of a man who had just been told something that had reordered his entire understanding of the morning. He looked down the corridor, found Evelyn, held her gaze, and mouthed 2 words she could read clearly from 30 feet away. "They know." 2 words. Harrove's mouth forming them from 30 feet of hospital corridor, his face the color of someone who'd stepped onto ground he'd believed was solid and felt it shift. Evelyn looked at the closed office door, at Harrove, at the phone still pressed to her ear. "Miss Drake," Voss said again, "this afternoon, can you make that work?" "Yes," she said, "I can make that work." She hung up and walked toward Harrove, and he moved to meet her with the urgent purposefulness of a man who needed to talk before whoever was in his office came back out. "Who is she?" Evelyn said low. "Sandra Voss, DoD Inspector General's office." He said it quietly, like the words themselves had weight he was trying not to drop. "She arrived 20 minutes ago. She didn't call ahead. What does she have?" "More than I expected." His voice had a quality she hadn't heard from him before, stripped of the administrative padding, the institutional buffer. Just a man talking. "She has employment records, internal communications, the supply rotation assignments going back 6 weeks. She has—" He stopped, looked at the door. "She has email chains, Evelyn, between Linda and Dr. Moore from your first week here." She went still. "What kind of email chains?" "The kind," he said carefully, "that discuss keeping you on supply rotation indefinitely, not as a probationary measure, as a—" The word Moore used was containment. He looked genuinely uncomfortable. "There's a phrase in one of them, Linda's, about not wanting someone with a— I'm paraphrasing, with a questionable background managing anything patient-facing." The corridor noise continued around them. Cartwheels, PA announcements, the ordinary sounds of a place that didn't know what was happening in one specific hallway. "How does Voss have internal hospital emails?"
Evelyn said, "Because someone sent them to her." Hargrove looked at his shoes for a moment. "I think it was Garrett." She thought about Garrett, about the 10 minutes he'd spent with Hargrove's assistant that morning, and whatever he'd said in those 10 minutes, and how Garrett had been at North Haven for 14 years, and had the institutional memory of a man who'd been keeping a ledger in his head that nobody had ever asked to see.
She thought about how he'd handed her the chest tube before she asked for it, about the way he'd said good placement to Okafor and meant it as a complete sentence. Okay, she said. Okay. Hargrove blinked. What do you need from me right now? He looked at her with the expression of a man who'd been preparing to manage her reaction and hadn't prepared for the absence of one. Voss wants to speak with you separately from administration, she said. He pulled out his phone, read something. She said, and I'm quoting, I want to hear from Nurse Drake before anyone else in this building tells me what I should think about her. Something moved in Evelyn's chest. Not warmth exactly, more like the recognition of a person who did their job the way it was meant to be done. I'll talk to her, Evelyn said, but I want Ridge in the room. Hargrove opened his mouth.
And said, because someone sent them to her. Hargrove looked at his shoes for a moment. I think it was Garrett. She thought about Garrett, about the 10 minutes he'd spent with Hargrove's assistant that morning, and whatever he'd said in those 10 minutes, and how Garrett had been at North Haven for 14 years, and had the institutional memory of a man who'd been keeping a ledger in his head that nobody had ever asked to see. She thought about how he'd handed her the chest tube before she asked for it, about the way he'd said good placement to Okafor and meant it as a complete sentence. Okay, she said. Okay. Hargrove blinked. What do you need from me right now? He looked at her with the expression of a man who'd been preparing to manage her reaction and hadn't prepared for the absence of one. Voss wants to speak with you separately from administration, she said. He pulled out his phone, read something. She said, and I'm quoting, I want to hear from Nurse Drake before anyone else in this building tells me what I should think about her. Something moved in Evelyn's chest. Not warmth exactly, more like the recognition of a person who did their job the way it was meant to be done. I'll talk to her, Evelyn said, but I want Ridge in the room. Hargrove opened his mouth. He's not here as military, she said. He's here as a witness. I want someone in the room who doesn't work for this hospital. Hargrove took a chair at the end of the table with the visible discomfort of a man who wasn't sure whether he was a participant or a witness. I'll be direct, Voss said. The DoD retrieval documentation from this morning triggered an automatic review process, standard protocol when civilian medical personnel are involved in priority operations. When the review team pulled the flag on your employment records, they found anomalies. She turned the laptop to face Evelyn. This is the scheduling database for North Haven's ER. Supply rotation assignments, trauma floor assignments, cross-referencing dates, 6 weeks of data. Evelyn looked at it. It was her schedule laid out in columns. Dates, assignments, the monotonous repetition of supply, inventory check, supply. And next to it, highlighted in a second column, the trauma floor assignments for that same period. Nurses with less experience than her, less time at the hospital, working patient-facing trauma cases while she restocked shelves. The disparity is significant, Voss said, but on its own, disparity isn't necessarily actionable. Scheduling decisions have a lot of justifications. She reached past the laptop and opened one of the external drives on her screen. What's actionable is this, the email chains. Evelyn read them. It took 4 minutes, and the room was very quiet while she did it. Ridge didn't move. Hargrove at the end of the table looked at the middle distance with the expression of someone counting the cost of things he'd signed without reading carefully enough. The emails were worse than Hargrove had summarized, which she'd suspected they would be. Moore's first message, sent 3 days after she'd corrected his compressions on the Sykes code, was 3 sentences long. The new ER support nurse, Drake, is a problem. Not disciplinary, said Moore, but of a background uncertainty issue, worth keeping her off patient-facing for the foreseeable future and seeing if she self-selects out. Linda's response was longer and more specific, laying out how to use the probationary structure to keep Evelyn on supply rotation indefinitely without triggering a formal performance review. There were 4 more exchanges over the following weeks, the most recent one from 11 days ago, where Linda had written, "She's not going anywhere on her own. I'm considering whether there are grounds for a competency review. Not because of anything she's done, but to get ahead of any issues before she decides to push back. She set the laptop down. Dr. Moore initiated this, she said. It wasn't a question. His first email predates Mercer's involvement by 48 hours, Voss confirmed, because I corrected him in front of staff. That would be consistent with the timeline. Voss's voice was neutral in the specific way that people trained in investigations were neutral. Not cold, but without the wobble of someone who was deciding what to feel while they were talking.
The documentation suggests a coordinated effort to limit your patient access, undermine your standing with administration, and create conditions that would result in your voluntary resignation or provide grounds for termination. Ridge beside her made a small sound that wasn't quite a word. She glanced at him. His jaw was set.
"What happens now?" Evelyn said. "Now I talk to them." Voss said it simply, separately. "And I talked to your HR department about what they knew and when they knew it, because someone in HR approved 6 consecutive weeks of supply rotation for a nurse with your qualifications without flagging it for review, and I'd like to understand why." She paused. "I'd also like to understand the role of the department chief, if there is one above Mercer's level, and whether any of this reached Hargrove before today." Hargrove at the end of the table looked like a man taking his medicine. "I wasn't aware of the email communications," he said. "I want to be clear about that." "I'm sure you do," Voss said in a tone that was not unkind and also not absolution. "We'll discuss it." They pulled Linda first. Evelyn didn't watch it happen. She was back on the ER floor, because there were still patients, because the ER didn't pause for institutional reckoning. But she heard about it in pieces, the way you heard about things in hospitals, through the specific information network of people who had been in hallways and adjacent rooms and had made it their business to know. Garrett told her that Linda had arrived at the conference room with her tablet, which was what Linda did when she wanted to feel prepared, and had come out of the conference room 40 minutes later without it. Priya told her that Moore had been called upstairs at 3:15, and that when he'd passed the nurse's station going to the elevator, his face had been the face of a person who had understood, possibly for the first time, that the room he'd walked into was not going to resemble the room he'd imagined. What Evelyn knew from her own observation was that at 4:02 p.m., HR Director Patricia Wells, who worked on the 3rd floor and whom Evelyn had met exactly once during her initial onboarding, appeared in the ER and asked Hargrove for a private word, and that Hargrove had the expression of a man who'd been having private words all day and was running out of places to have them. What she also knew was that the staff on the ER floor were behaving differently, not dramatically, not with the performative contrition of a workplace caught doing something wrong and overcorrecting. It was subtler than that. The way Marcus had asked her opinion on a patient presentation without the half-second hesitation that had been there since she'd arrived, as though he'd always been about to ask, and something had finally moved out of the way.
The way Delgado had fallen into step with her during a routine transfer and said simply, "For what it's worth, I never thought you were in the right rotation," and hadn't waited for a response, just kept moving. Small things, adjustments in orientation, the way a room adjusted when the furniture was rearranged. She didn't know what to do with it exactly. She was working on that. At 4:45, Ridge found her. He came into the ER with the look of someone who'd been in the administrative floor for 3 hours and had experienced all of it at close range. He'd taken off his jacket at some point and was carrying it over one arm, which was the first time she'd seen him look anything less than completely composed. "Boss is done with the preliminary interviews," he said. "She wants you again." "What's the headline?" Moore submitted a written statement. He said it with the particular care of someone managing how much to dispense at once. He acknowledged the email chain. He acknowledged that his initial communication to Mercer was a pause. He used the phrase professionally motivated, which is the phrase people use when they don't want to say personal. He was embarrassed, Evelyn said, about the compressions. He wanted me gone because I'd seen him get it wrong. That's what Voss's team read it as. Yes. And Linda ran with it. Linda built infrastructure around it. Ridge's voice had an edge to it that she suspected he didn't let out often. The rotation scheduling, the potential competency review she was pre-planning. That wasn't just going along with Moore. That wasn't its own project. Evelyn brought about the 11 years Linda had spent building the architecture of that department, the way she'd run it, and she had run it competently in crisis, and how that authority had become something you didn't question, something that had its own gravity. She thought about how the two things could exist simultaneously. A person who ran a trauma bay correctory, and who had also done what those emails described, without seeing the contradiction, because the authority had become indistinguishable from the person. "What does Voss have authority to do?" she said. "The DoD component gives her investigative authority over anything that impacted a service member or a military operation. Riker's case clears that bar." Ridge folded his jacket over the other arm.
She's also made a referral to the state nursing board regarding Mercer and the conditions under which you were kept off patient-facing rotation. That's not DoD, That's a separate track, the nursing board. Yes, she thought about that. About what a nursing board investigation meant for Linda's 11 years. About the weight of a referral like that, and how long it took to resolve, and what it did to a career while it was resolving. What about more? She said he's a resident, which means the hospital's credentialing committee has authority over him. Hargrove's already called an emergency review. Ridge looked at her. I think Hargrove's in self-preservation mode, honestly, but self-preservation and the right outcome aren't mutually exclusive. No, she agreed. They're not. She went back upstairs. The second meeting with Voss was shorter and different in texture from the first. Voss asked specific questions, and Evelyn answered them with the same precision she'd used on patient reports. Not more, not less, exactly what was asked. She described her first week, the compression incident, the escalating supply rotation, the way she'd flagged supply discrepancies that had gone unacknowledged, done the job she'd been assigned, and been kept in that job past any reasonable probationary period by a process she now understood had been designed to be indefinite. She also described the mass casualty event that afternoon, Vasquez's patient, the fast imaging, the interventions, the 8-minute hold that had gotten him to the O. Voss listened to all of it without interrupting.
When Evelyn finished, she looked at her legal pad and then at Evelyn and said, I want to ask you something that's outside the formal scope of this review. Okay, when you walked into that ER this morning and they called you Viper, how did it feel? The question caught her off guard, not because it was hostile, but because it wasn't procedural, and everything else today had been procedural. Like a door I'd been keeping closed opened, she said after a moment, and I hadn't decided yet whether I was relieved or not. Voss nodded slowly. Are you now? Evelyn looked out the window. Briar Falls was doing what it did in the early evening, the light going gold over the mountains, the kind of light that made the town look like a place someone had designed specifically to be restful, which was why she'd chosen it. Ask me in a week, she said. Something in Voss's expression, not quite a smile, but the architecture of one. Fair enough. The staff meeting happened at 6 p.m. as Hargrove had promised, in the same conference room that smelled like carpet cleaner, now rearranged with more chairs. Most of the ER staff was there. The ones whose shifts had ended stayed anyway, which said something, though she wasn't sure exactly what. Hargrove stood at the front of the room with the posture of a man who'd spent the afternoon revising what he was going to say. He looked tired in the specific way of someone who'd done necessary and uncomfortable things and was on the other side of them now. Linda was not there. Moore was not there. Those absences were louder than most of what Hargrove said, which was administrative process language about reviews and investigations and the hospital's commitment to workplace standards. The content mattered less than the fact of it, that he was standing there at all, saying it to the people who worked in that department, and that 2 names were conspicuously missing from the room. Partway through, Hargrove looked directly at Evelyn. I want to say in front of this department that the assignment structure for Nurse Drake over the past 6 weeks did not reflect her qualifications and should have been reviewed sooner. He said it the way people said things they'd written out beforehand, but the writing out didn't make it untrue. That's a failure of oversight, at several levels, including mine, and I want to name it clearly. The room was quiet. Priya, 2 chairs down from Evelyn, exhaled audibly.
Evelyn looked at the table and said nothing because there was nothing she needed to say in this room at this moment that the morning hadn't already said for her. After the meeting, she found Garrett in the break room. He was making coffee, real coffee, from grounds he'd apparently brought from home, which explained why his always smelt better than the machine's product. It was you, she said, who sent the emails to Voss. He poured water into the machine. I've had them for 3 weeks. I couldn't decide what to do with them. He looked at the coffee maker. The thing this morning made it easy to decide. How'd you get them? Linda forwarded one of the chains to the whole charge team by mistake. Wrong distribution list. He shrugged one shoulder. I kept it. I didn't know why at the time. I just kept it. She thought about the version of this morning where Garrett had not kept it, where the emails had been deleted and forgotten, where no one had sent anything to Voss, where the DoD documentation had been the only tool, and Linda had found some way to work around it. Thank you, she said. He poured the coffee, handed her a cup. It was, unlike the paper cup from that morning, actually good. She was standing there drinking it when her phone buzzed again. Not Voss this time, a number she recognized, Wren's office.
She'd missed their Thursday session this week. She looked at the phone for a moment and thought about the cedar smell of the office and the white noise machine outside the door, and the questions Wren asked that circled things without landing on them until you were ready. She texted back, "Can we reschedule? It's been a day." The response came in under a minute. "I heard small town.
"Take your time. I'm here." She put the phone in her pocket. Outside the break room window, Briar Falls was doing the thing it did at dusk, when the mountains caught the last light and held it. The particular color of a place that didn't know it was beautiful, because it had always been that way. She'd run past that ridge every morning for 6 weeks and counted it as one of the reliable things. It was still reliable. She didn't see Linda again until 7:15 p.m. She hadn't expected to. The reasonable assumption was that Linda had been told to go home pending review, which was the usual administrative response when an investigation was active. Keep the relevant parties separated from the environment until the process determined the next step. But Linda had come back for her things. She was at the charge desk when Evelyn came back through the ER to collect her own bag before leaving. The tablet was there, and a cardigan Linda kept on the back of the chair, and a mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse" in a font that someone had thought was funny. Linda was putting these things into a tote bag with the careful, deliberate movements of a person doing a mundane task so they didn't have to think about what the task meant. Evelyn stopped. She should have kept walking. She knew that there was nothing productive available in this moment, no exchange that was going to resolve anything, no sentence that was going to be worth the energy it cost. She knew this about herself. She was better at the long view than the immediate one, usually better at deciding what mattered in a week than what mattered in the next 5 seconds. She kept walking. She was almost to the door when Linda spoke. "I'm not going to pretend I handled this correctly." Her voice was even, not apologetic, not hard either, just level in the way of someone who'd been thinking for several hours and had arrived somewhere. "But I want you to know that I didn't think I was doing anything wrong. I thought—" She stopped.
"I thought I was protecting the department," Evelyn turned. "From me," she said. Linda met her eyes. "From an unknown quantity. Because of more. Because I didn't know who you were." Something moved in her expression that wasn't easy to look at. Not guilt exactly, but its raw material. "I still don't really. I know what was in that room this morning. I know what Voss told me this afternoon. I know—" She stopped again. "I know what Garrett said to Harov." "What did you expect?" Evelyn said. "When you kept me on supply, did you expect me to just leave?" "I expected you to push back," Linda said. "And when you didn't, I assumed it meant I'd read you correctly. You read my silence as confirmation." "Yes, my silence was me being careful," Evelyn said, "not compliant." Linda held her gaze for 3 seconds. 5. Then she picked up her tote bag. "I know that now," she said. She walked out the ambulance bay doors and they closed behind her, and Evelyn stood in the ER she'd been stocking shelves in for 6 weeks and breathed slowly, the way she'd been practicing. The department was quieter now. End of shift, the evening rotation coming in, the particular handover energy of a place resetting itself for the next 8 hours. Priya was at the nurse's station doing her charting. Marcus was somewhere in the back. The monitors beeped their steady rhythms. She picked up her bag. Her phone buzzed again. She almost didn't look at it, but it was Ridge's number, and something in the timing of it, 7:22 p.m., later than she'd have expected from him, made her open it. "Riker's asking for you. Also, we have a problem." She stared at the message. Then Voss found something in Moore's employment file. "Not from here. From before North Haven. You need to see it tonight." She stood in the doorway of the ER she'd been invisible in for 6 weeks, bag over her shoulder, the Colorado evening through the glass of the ambulance bay doors, and she read the message a second time. From before North Haven. Whatever Moore had done, whatever was in that file, it hadn't started with a compression error and a misdirected email. It had started somewhere else, with someone else. And Linda's department had not been the first place he tried to contain a problem by eliminating the person who'd seen it. She typed back one word, "Coming," and then she walked toward Riker's room, and whatever was waiting in that file, and the version of this situation she hadn't known existed until 30 seconds ago. Riker's room was dim when she got there, the overhead light off, and only the monitors glowed doing the work. He was propped up slightly more than she'd last seen him, which was progress. The body's first arguments against lying flat, the early negotiations with gravity. He looked like someone who'd been in surgery that morning and was remembering it, which was exactly what he was. Ridge was already there, standing near the window with his phone in his hand, and the expression of a man who'd spent the last 20 minutes deciding how to frame something. She looked at Ridge first. "Show me." He handed her the phone. The document on the screen was a personnel complaint record, not military, civilian, from a hospital in New Mexico called Crestview Regional Medical Center, filed 14 months ago. The complainant was a surgical nurse named Barbara O'Hay, and the complaint was detailed and specific, that Dr. Caleb Moore, then a resident at Crestview, had responded to her correction of his sterile field technique during a procedure,
by initiating a coordinated campaign to have her reassigned, questioned her competency to administration in writing, and ultimately contributed to conditions that led to her voluntary resignation 7 months later. The complaint had been reviewed, filed, and then marked administratively resolved, a phrase that, in Evelyn's experience, meant someone had decided the cost of pursuing it exceeded the cost of letting it settle. Barbara O'Hay had left nursing entirely. Her license was current, but inactive. Evelyn read it twice. Then she handed the phone back. "He's done this before," she said. "At minimum once that generated a paper trail," Ridge said. "Voss thinks there may be others. She's requested records from his residency program. He came to North Haven after Crestview, 8 months after the complaint was filed. The timing?" Ridge looked at the phone. "Crestview's administration didn't flag it when they gave his reference. They marked the complaint resolved and gave him a clean transition." She stood with that for a moment. Barbara O'Hay, who had corrected a sterile field technique, a patient safety issue, an entirely correct intervention, and had spent 7 months being systematically dismantled before deciding the job wasn't worth her life. A woman whose name Evelyn hadn't known this morning and would not forget.
What's Voss going to do with it? She said she's already been on the phone with Crestview's compliance office, and she's referred the OA complaint to the state medical board in New Mexico for retroactive review. Ridge paused. Moore's credentialing committee meeting here has been expanded. They're looking at the full picture now. OA, the emails this morning, the Sykes code, all of it. Riker from the bed said, "How bad is it for him?" They both looked at him. He'd been listening with his eyes half open, in the way of someone conserving energy while remaining aware. "Bad enough," Evelyn said. "Good." He sat without satisfaction, just as a factual assessment. "Sit down, Evelyn. You look like you've been awake for 20 hours. 15, she said, and sat. The chair beside his bed was the standard hospital variety, too rigid, slightly too low, and she sat in it and felt the accumulated weight of the day arrange itself in her joints in a way that suggested her body was beginning to submit its invoice. She was tired in a way that had texture to it, that went past the physical into something more complicated, the exhaustion of having been many different versions of herself in one Tuesday, and not yet having sorted out which one was going to persist. "Okafor came by an hour ago," Riker said. She said the surgery was cleaner than she expected given the condition of the field prep. The tube bought time. She said that too. He looked at her with the direct attention that was one of the things she remembered about him. He didn't look at people sideways. Never had. She also said she'd heard about the mass casualty this afternoon, Vasquez's patient. He made it to the OR. "I know," Vasquez told her. Riker's hand moved slightly on the blanket, not reaching, just adjusting. "You've had a full day. You could say that." Ridge at the window looked at his phone again. "Voss wants a call at 8. She's briefing the DOD liaison tonight." He looked at Evelyn. "You don't have to be on it. Your part of the documentation is complete." "I know," she said. "I'll be on it anyway." He nodded once, unsurprised. Riker's eyes had been moving between them during this exchange with the expression of someone reading a relationship from its shorthand. "You two didn't know each other before today," he said finally. It wasn't a question. "No," Ridge confirmed. "Huh."
Riker settled back slightly. "Feels like longer." Neither Evelyn nor Ridge answered that, because it was the kind of observation that was true and didn't need expanding. The monitor beeped. Outside in the corridor, the evening shift was doing its quiet work. Somewhere down the hall, a door opened and closed. "I need to ask you something," Riker said. He was looking at the ceiling, the particular angle of a person thinking through how to say a thing. "And I need you to actually answer it, not the version where you say you're fine and change the subject." "I'm listening," she said. "What do you want?" "Not what you're going to do, not what the situation calls for." He looked at her. "What do you actually want?" The question sat in the room for a moment. Outside, the Colorado dark had settled in fully, and the mountains were invisible now, just their absence against the star-scattered sky. "I want to be a nurse," she said. "Here, in an emergency department where I can do what I'm trained to do." She paused. "And I want to sleep through the night more than twice a week." Riker's expression didn't change, but something in it did. "That's a real answer." "You asked for one." "I did." He was quiet for a moment. "You should know that whatever happens with the review, whatever Voss's process produces, the unit put in a formal commendation this afternoon for this morning. Your name is on a DOD record now as the responding medic who preserved Riker's life during a priority retrieval operation." He said his own name with a slight dryness, aware of the peculiarity of it. "That's not going away. Whatever anyone at this hospital says or tries to retroactively frame, that document exists." She looked at him. "You're telling me I have paper?" "You have very official paper," he confirmed. Ridge made sure of it.
She glanced at Ridge, who was looking out the window with the studious neutrality of a man who hadn't done anything worth mentioning. "Thank you," she said to the window.
The window said. The 8 p.m. call with Voss lasted 40 minutes and was mostly logistics. The referrals, the timelines, the various institutional processes now in motion across 2 states and multiple oversight bodies. Voss spoke with the flat efficiency of someone who had done this many times, and what Evelyn took from it was that the machinery of consequence was now moving under its own momentum. She'd been the catalyst. The reaction didn't need her anymore to sustain itself. After the call, she drove home. The apartment was exactly as she left it. The empty bookshelf, the second-hand couch, the coffee maker with its perpetual small red light. She stood in the middle of it for a moment and thought about what Riker had asked her, what she wanted. The smaller life had looked a certain way, the morning runs, the supply cart, the deliberately bounded existence. She'd built it to be survivable, which it had been, mostly, but survivable and livable weren't the same thing, and she'd known that on some level for a while, had felt the gap between them widening without knowing exactly when it had started. She made tea she didn't really want, and sat on the second-hand couch and let the day happen in her memory in reverse order. The way her brain processed things when it was too tired for anything but chronology. Riker's question, Linda at the charge desk, Hargrove in the conference room, Voss's legal pad, Moore in the hallway, the arms uncrossed. Garrett's good coffee, the mass casualty, the fast probe, Vasquez, the chest tube, the soldiers in the bay, the supply cart, the 6 weeks before all of it. At some point, she fell asleep sitting up, which told her something about the invoice her body had been submitting. The credentialing committee met the following morning. She wasn't in the room. She didn't need to be. Her role in what the committee was reviewing was already documented in formats that didn't require her presence. She was on the ER floor working, because she had been assigned to trauma support for the first time since her arrival, and that was the thing she was going to do.
Hargrove had called her that morning before her shift to tell her about the assignment change. He'd done it personally, not through a scheduling system, which she understood was his way of making the act deliberate. She thanked him and hung up and gone to work. Priya was in Trauma 1 when she arrived, doing her pre-shift setup, and she looked up when Evelyn came in and said, "Finally," in a tone that contained 6 weeks of opinions. "Don't," Evelyn said, but without heat. "I'm just saying," Priya turned back to her setup. "The supply cart was not your destiny. Can we focus on the shift?" "Focusing?" Priya said, and she was smiling at the supply cart, which struck Evelyn as an appropriate response given the circumstances. The morning was busy in the ways that ER mornings were busy. Not catastrophic, not a mass casualty event, just the steady, reliable influx of human bodies having problems in the variety of ways human bodies had problems. A construction worker with a laceration that needed more than it looked like. A teenager with an asthma exacerbation, whose inhaler technique had been wrong for 3 years and nobody had corrected her. An elderly man whose medication interaction had gone unnoticed by 3 separate specialists for 4 months. She worked. She was good at it. That hadn't changed in 6 weeks of supply rotation, and it hadn't changed overnight. It had just been given a different room. At 10:30, Garrett found her between patients. "Committee's done," he said. She waited. "Moore's been suspended, pending full review. They're pulling his cases for the past 6 months for independent audit." He paused. "Press Views Board has reopened the OS complaint. It'll take time, but he lifted one shoulder. It's open." She thought about Barbara Away, Say, whose license was current and inactive, who had left the job because a man's ego had been more important than her right to do it. She hoped Away found out what had been reopened. She hoped it mattered. "And Linda?" she said. "State Nursing Board confirmed receipt of Voss's referral this morning. Formal inquiry starts in 2 weeks." His voice was careful with this part, as though he understood it was complicated. Hargrove placed her on administrative leave, paid, pending the inquiry's findings.
She nodded. It was, she thought, the shape of justice in the real world. Not clean, not cinematic, not the version where every consequence arrived on schedule with appropriate weight. It was investigations and timelines and processes that would take months. It was Barbara Away having to decide whether to engage with a reopened complaint that had already cost her a career. It was Moore suspended but not yet adjudicated. Linda on leave but not yet resolved. The machinery of accountability was slow and imperfect, and sometimes it ground the wrong things and missed others entirely. But it was moving. It was real. And the emails were on record, and the footage was on record, and she had very official paper with her name on it, and none of that was going back into the drawer. "Garrett," she said. He looked at her. "You kept that email for 3 weeks." "I did. It cost you something sending it." He considered that honestly, which was what she'd expected from him. He wasn't the kind of person who deflected. "I've been here 14 years, he said. "I've watched things happen in this department that I should have pushed back on sooner. This one I could actually do something about." He looked at the middle distance for a moment. "Better late than not at all." "Yeah," she said. "It is." Riker was discharged on Friday. He walked out under his own power, miles slowly, one hand on the rail in the corridor with the careful deliberateness of someone whose body had given them a firm lesson in humility and who was respecting it. And Ridge was there, and 2 members of the team who'd come back from wherever they'd been staged. And the small gathering in the corridor outside his room had the quality of something trying not to be a ceremony, but being one anyway. Evelyn was there because she'd been asked to be, and because she wanted to be, which were 2 things that had not always been true simultaneously in her life, and she noted it. Okafor was there too. She'd come down from the surgical floor in her white coat, brief, professional, the posture of someone who had 30 other things to do and had made a specific decision to be present for this one. She shook Riker's hand and said something to him quietly that Evelyn couldn't hear, and he nodded and looked at her with the expression of a man who understood that a surgeon had given him back his life, and was trying to find the right size for that gratitude. Then Okafor looked at Evelyn. "Your placement," she said.
"It's trauma support now, as of yesterday." Okafor nodded, the nod of someone filing information into a category labeled correct. "Good." Then she was gone, back to the elevator, back to the floor above, back to the 30 other things. Reese, standing near Riker with his hands in his pockets, caught Evelyn's eye and gave her a look that said, "Told you," without saying anything, which she found irritating in the specific way she found things irritating when they were also right. Ridge approached her while the team was getting Riker situated for transport. He was holding something. She recognized it before he held it out. The patch, subdued, worn at the edges from age or handling, the unit insignia that she'd seen on gear and on correspondence for 3 years and had packed away in the bottom of a box when she'd packed everything else. He held it out. "Riker's idea," he said. "He wanted to give it to you himself, but the surgeon told him not to lift his arm above his shoulder yet, and apparently the patch is in his left kit bag." She looked at it in Ridge's palm. "You earned it twice," Ridge said. "Then and now." She picked it up. It was lighter than it looked. It always had been. She'd been surprised by that the first time, how something that heavy with meaning weighed almost nothing in your hand. She held it for a moment, turning it slightly, the fabric worn smooth in one corner. She thought about the woman who had first received this, about what that woman had done and seen and survived, and what the surviving had cost her, about the apartment with the empty bookshelf and the morning runs, and the deliberately small life, and whether any of it had been wasted, or whether it had been exactly what it needed to be, the necessary distance between what broke her and what made her come back. She thought about Wren's office and the white noise machine, and the question, what do you do when the noise gets loud? Breathe, she'd said. Count the exits. She'd been counting exits for 2 years. That wasn't nothing. That was how you survived the part that had to be survived. But you couldn't spend your whole life standing in doorways. "I'm still a nurse," she said. "That's what I am. That's what I want to be." Ridge waited. "But I'll take it," she said. "Because it's true. Both things can be true." She slipped the patch into the pocket of her scrubs. Ridge's expression didn't perform anything, didn't manufacture the moment into something larger than it was. He just nodded once. The nod of a man who understood that some things didn't need ornamentation. "We'll be in touch," he said. "Not to pull you back in, just in touch." "I know," she said. Riker, from his wheelchair, said, "Evelyn?" She looked at him. "Don't stock any more shelves," he said. "I'm going to choose to interpret that as general life advice rather than commentary on supply management." "It's both," he said, and let Ridge wheel him toward the elevator. She watched them go. The team. Ridge. Riker in his wheelchair with his left arm careful and his eyes forward. Moving toward the elevator and the exit and whatever came next for all of them. The doors closed. The corridor was ordinary again.
She stood in it for a moment, her hand against the patch in her pocket, and then she turned and walked back toward the ER. 3 weeks later, the nursing board notified North Haven Medical Center that its preliminary inquiry into the conduct of charge nurse Linda Mercer had found sufficient grounds to proceed to a formal investigation. The specific areas under review included improper use of scheduling authority to restrict a qualified nurse's patient-facing access, coordination with resident medical staff to implement unofficial disciplinary measures outside of established HR protocols, and falsification of the grounds cited in a proposed competency review that had never been formally filed but had been documented in internal communications. Linda's attorney issued a statement. It said the standard things. The Colorado Medical Board opened a parallel inquiry into Dr. Caleb Moore's conduct at North Haven, incorporating Voss's referral and the findings of the Credentialing Committee's internal audit. 14 of Moore's cases from the previous 6 months were flagged for independent review.
3 contained documentation inconsistencies that the auditors referred for further investigation. In New Mexico, the state medical board's retroactive review of the OSA complaint was assigned to a senior investigator and given a 6-month timeline. Barbara O., who learned about the reopened inquiry through a call from a New Mexico board representative, contacted the investigator the same day. Her license was still current. Her statement when she gave it was 40 pages long and had apparently been sitting in a document on her computer for over a year, updated periodically, waiting. Hargrove sent Evelyn a formal letter of acknowledgement, not an apology exactly, but a documented acknowledgement that the conditions of her employment during her first 6 weeks had not met the hospital standards, and that a review of probationary assignment protocols was underway. HR Director Patricia Wells had, according to Priya, who had sources Evelyn had stopped asking about, submitted her own resignation 2 weeks after the inquiry began, citing personal reasons. None of it was fast. None of it was satisfying in the way that stories about justice were satisfying when the satisfaction arrived in a single moment. It was the actual texture of accountability, protracted and procedural, and requiring the sustained attention of people willing to see it through. Voss's office continued to follow up. Garrett had been interviewed twice. Ridge had submitted a written statement from wherever he'd gone, which Evelyn knew because he told her he was going to. She went to Wren on the Thursday after everything broke open.
She sat in the chair across from Wren's desk in the cedar-smelling office with the white noise machine outside, and she said, "I don't know how I feel about any of it." "That's fine," Wren said. "I feel like I should feel something more definitive, vindicated or settled. Or you had one day that compressed about a year's worth of experience into it." Wren said, "You don't have to feel settled. You just have to feel what you actually feel." "I feel tired," Evelyn said, "and I feel like I want to keep working. And I feel like the two things are going to have to coexist for a while." "That's about the most honest thing you've said in this room," Wren told her. Evelyn looked at the window. Outside, Briar Falls was doing what it did in early November, the first cold coming in off the mountains, the light changing, the particular quality of air that carried winter's opening argument. "I spent 2 years making myself small enough to fit into a space that wouldn't ask anything of me," she said, "and I think that was necessary. I think I needed that. But I also think I was starting to disappear into it a little. Like the smallness was becoming the thing instead of the shelter." Wren was quiet, which was one of her better qualities. "I walked out from behind a supply cart," Evelyn said, "and I think that's what I've been trying to figure out how to do for 2 years. Not the cart specifically, just stopping standing behind things." "Are you going to keep running in the mornings?" Wren said. The question was so sideways that Evelyn almost laughed. "Yes, good. Keep that." "It's not a coping mechanism. I just like running." "I know," Wren said. "That's why I said keep it." The formal commendation from the Department of Defense arrived at North Haven Medical Center on a Tuesday, exactly 1 month after the morning the helicopters had landed. It was addressed to Evelyn Drake, RN, and it cited her role in preserving the life of a priority personnel asset under time-critical conditions using improvised resources. It was signed by a name several pay grades above anyone Evelyn had interacted with directly, and it was CC'd to the hospital's administration and to the Colorado State Nursing Board.
Hargrove had it framed. She had not asked him to do this. She found out about it when she came into the ER on a Wednesday morning, and there it was on the wall near the charge desk, between the fire evacuation map and the ACLS algorithm poster. The frame was plain wood, which she suspected Hargrove had chosen because he wasn't sure of her taste and had defaulted to inoffensive. She stood in front of it for a moment. Priya appeared at her elbow. "He asked everyone whether to put it up. We said yes." "Everyone?" "Everyone's still here." A pause that contained Linda's absence and Moore's without naming them. It was unanimous.
Evelyn looked at the commendation, her name in official type on official letterhead on the wall of the department where she'd restocked crash carts and counted suture kits and been referred to as the supply girl. She thought about what it meant about the version of herself that had arrived here 6 weeks before that Tuesday with a duffel bag and a redacted file and the deliberate intention of being nobody. She understood why she'd made that choice. She didn't regret it exactly. She'd needed the quiet, the smaller scale, the distance from everything that had been too loud for too long. She'd needed Wren's office and the morning runs and the mountains at the edge of town and the space to learn how to breathe differently. But she also understood now that invisibility was only a shelter if you were planning to leave it eventually. If you stayed, it became a different kind of trap. Not the trap someone else built for you, but the one you built yourself, neat and private and completely your own. The trap she'd been building had a supply card in it. She didn't need the card anymore. She wasn't the woman who'd walked in here with her head down and her history folded up and her whole professional self compressed into the smallest possible shape. She wasn't the call sign either. That version of her belonged to a context that no longer existed in the same way, and she held it with respect and some grief, and the understanding that what it had made her was not gone, just integrated. She was Evelyn Drake, RN.
She was a nurse who had worked combat zones and mass casualty events, and a Tuesday in Colorado that had turned out to be all of the above. She was a woman who had corrected a resident's compressions and been punished for it, and come out the other side of that punishment with her credentials intact and her instincts confirmed. She was imperfect and tired, and still figuring out what the empty bookshelf should hold, and she had a patch in her pocket that she hadn't decided where to put yet, and she had a Thursday appointment with a good therapist, and a morning route past the edge of town where the mountains were. That was who she was, all of it, simultaneously without any part of it canceling any other part out. She touched the frame once briefly and went to work. The ER was loud. The monitors beeped and the PA called names, and someone's cart had a wheel that needed oil. And Priya was already in trauma 2, talking fast to a paramedic. And Garrett was making his good coffee. And the morning was full and demanding and completely ordinary in the way that extraordinary things eventually blessedly became ordinary. She picked up the chart at Station 1. 44-year-old male, chest pain, diaphoretic, history of hypertension. She read it in the 10 seconds it took to walk to his curtain, and when she pushed the curtain aside and he looked up at her with the frightened and slightly embarrassed expression of a man who'd been trying to convince himself this wasn't serious, she looked back at him with the full and undivided attention of someone who had nowhere else to be and nothing to prove.
"Tell me when it started," she said, and she listened. "That was the thing nobody trained you for and nobody could take from you. The quality of attention you brought to the space between a person and their worst moment. The willingness to be fully present in that space, without shortcuts, without the protective distance of someone going through notions. It was the thing she'd been doing her whole career, in forward operating bases and trauma bays, and yes, in supply rooms, where she'd noticed a discrepancy in the chest seal logs and written it down, because it mattered, even when nobody thought she did. The woman they had ignored had never stopped paying attention. That had always been her power, quiet, steady, and impossible to take away, because it lived in her, not in any title or assignment or wall-mounted commendation, not in a patch or a call sign or what any institutional process concluded about her worth. It had been there every single day she'd shown up. That always had been.